students. So this is our last lecture for crisis intervention, and it is based on some material that you don't have a lot of access to, but I want to talk with you about the triage assessment form. I'm going to record this in sections of 15 minutes. In fact, I need to get my phone to use a timer, but I'll keep talking as I get my phone. The triage assessment form is an assessment form that can be used, for example, if you were working on a crisis line, or even at your office if you liked using a measure to figure out the levels at which you think your client is functioning. And so it's a nice way to quantify what you think you're seeing in front of you. And at first, when you look at the triage assessment form, it seems, well, there's just a lot of detail on it. And so I don't want you to get too, overwrought about each of the scales and what they mean and so on. But you will, at first, when you look at it, probably think that it's kind of just a lot of data to take in. So I'll try to talk with you a little bit about the form generally itself, how it works, what the scales are like, what our goals are in using a triage assessment form, and then really just at the end we'll talk about some information related to how it is you use it when you're rating a client's level of functioning. So it is said to be a rapid but systematic technique for the crisis worker to use to understand the client's level of functioning and how the client interprets or makes meaning of the crisis. So remember now, always when we talk about crisis, we want to think about a couple of concepts. One of those is disequilibrium versus the client being in equilibrium. And then another one of these concepts is immobility and whether the client's more mobile. So really these are not so much concepts as continuums of functioning. And so I'll just review with you that, a client who's in disequilibrium, has just a lack of emotional stability, or they have a lack of feeling like they're in balance, or that they don't even look like they have poise. And then on the opposite end of that, a client who is in equilibrium, is just in a more of a calm mental state, and their thinking is more clear, their ability to take suggestion or even come up with their own suggestions is probably going to be, more high functioning. And I would just say that sometimes you can be working with a client who is experiencing a crisis and they aren't in a state of disequilibrium, but they are in a state of immobility. And so these are interesting concepts to think about as you observe your client and try to figure out what, where they are and what you see in front of you. To review this concept of, the continuum of being immobile to being mobile, remember that, a state of immobility is when the person is they're just not immediately capable of changing or coping in response to what is going on, what the crisis constitutes. And then a person who's mobile is more able to respond and to adjust their actions and their emotions and just be able to function, when moods change or situations change. And so, of course, our goal in crisis intervention is to help take the client from any state of disequilibrium that they're in and try to help them feel like they're more balanced and more calm, and certainly take them from a state of being immobile to a state of actually having some mobility, being able to take some action that's useful. And so I would just say that this whole semester what we've been working on in using the ABC model is to do those very things. So you've been working on the mechanics of how to help the client all along in this class and practicing that. And this lecture and exercise for Wednesday is really just about having an instrument that you can use to assess where the client is on these two continuums. So it's interesting to think about this issue of immobility and mobility and disequilibrium and equilibrium. Is a nice metaphor for that is a person who's just driving a car in life. And for most of us, you know, we have some bumps in the road when we're driving our car. Sometimes, you know, our tires might get out of balance and things are pulling us off into one direction or another direction. But generally, you know, we can make our way up a hill and make our way down a hill, and we're not crashing, and we're just mostly in control. But a client who's, you know, in crisis is not, you know, driving their car, driving the car of life in a very controlled way. And so they might be experiencing difficulty in steering or braking or successfully just navigating the road. And so they're temporarily out of control, we hope. We hope it's temporary, and we hope that when we work with a client to do crisis intervention, that we're helping them get themselves back in control or get their car back on the road, as this metaphor goes. So another piece of thought I'd like you to keep in mind as we talk about these things is another continuum that has to do with the activity level or the action level of the crisis worker. So early on in the crisis intervention, we want to be looking at, you know, how mobile the client is, and if the client is not very mobile, then it's going to be on us as crisis workers to be more active and insert more directiveness to the client to help them become more mobile. And then if the client is just in a bit of a bump of the road, and they're able to function themselves fairly well but just want to talk about it or to check out their ideas about how to manage their crisis, we don't have to be as directive in our assisting of the client. And so, you know, well, in my teaching of your helping skills in our program, I've often, you know, directed us to back off just a little bit and not try to boss the client around too much. But in crisis intervention, sometimes it's actually, you know, something that the client really needs for us to be directive and to make suggestions and to request that the client take an action and report back to us. So this continuum of action is another interesting piece as you think about taking, you know, a client and in a crisis and helping them move through it. Assessment is important in crisis intervention, and this is really the first tool that you've been exposed to. There are lots of assessment tools out there, but it'll be nice for you to be exposed to one that's pretty highly rated. This is a very, you know, well-respected assessment tool, and you know, assessment helps us do several things. It helps us to figure out how severe the crisis is, or certainly how severe the client interprets the crisis to be. It also, in this assessment, we can determine the client's level of mobility or immobility in 3 areas. So when we look at the actual instrument, you're going to see that you'll be measuring the client's functioning in their affect or their feelings, and in their behavioral levels, and then in their thoughts or cognitions. And alternatives and coping mechanisms and support systems and other resources available to the client. Sometimes we might, you know, get information about that as we're talking to the client and listening to them and finding out what resources they have or coping mechanisms they have or people that they have to assist them as they try to get this crisis under control. Another thing that assessment helps us do is get a sense of the client's level of lethality. And so when we get into the ratings discussion using this triage assessment form, I'll talk with you a little bit about lethality levels. And how well the crisis worker is doing in de-escalating or diffusing the client's crisis is something that gets measured or assessed. So often I think it's a good idea in using this particular form to do an assessment at the outset of what you think you're seeing, where the client is, and how you're rating the client and their level of severity. And then after you've finished acting with the client or intervening with the client, you want to give the client a secondary rating that hopefully shows that you've made some progress in lowering the client's impairment on all 3 levels. Also, I think doing the secondary rating after the intervention, you can see where there might be a bump in one particular area, whether it's feelings or cognitions or behaviors, where the client really might need a little bit more work or some more coaching. And so these are all good reasons why using assessment that has kind of a scale and a numerical measure to it, can give you some objective, sense of where your client is, and also an objective sense of how much you've helped your client in the intervention. How has the TAF, or the triage assessment form, been tested and normed and researched? There's a lot of information about this, but I think in general it's interesting for you to note that it's been used widely by police officers and first responders, people who answer crisis lines, and crisis workers, counselors, teachers, residence hall staff, I'm trying to think, community agency workers. I know Friend to Friend actually has used it before. And so all of these types of workers have been exposed at one time or another in research studies using the triage assessment form. And some interesting things have been revealed. One of those things is that police officers or sheriffs tend to rate the level of impairment as more severe, generally. And people who are in the mental health field or human services field or counseling field tend to rate the level of severity a little bit less severely. And it's thought that the police officers and sheriffs and those kinds of workers maybe rate things as more severe because they always have to be more careful about how dangerous a situation is, and they would rather, kind of rate on the higher side of danger than not. And mental health workers generally, when doing this kind of research, have said, well, I see people in crisis all the time, and I know that sometimes it's something that can actually be lessened, and I'm just not as apt to rate somebody as severely out of control. So that's interesting, I think, that set of findings about the triage assessment form and how people tend to rate and interrate into rating ability or stability. And one thing I would say is, as we work together on Wednesday and do maybe an exercise related to this, if I ask you, what you would have given somebody for their rating on one of the scales, not all of you are going to agree. You might, have scale ratings that are a little bit different from one another. Let's see, overall the low impairment and high impairment scales show more consistency when research is done on how different groups rate clients who have the same issue. And the moderate impairment scales that are in the middle of the triage assessment form seem to be the ones where people have less agreement. So the test developers or the assessment developers, people who develop the forms say, generally, just don't overthink it when you're doing it. Don't get too bogged down in trying to achieve a perfect assessment of someone. So after helping using the ABC model of crisis intervention, which you've been taught this whole semester, you can use the process of re-rating, and I've already talked with you about that, just to see, if the client is getting back to a better level of mobility and a better level of functioning and equilibrium, feeling more in control. So let's look at a brief review of the scales. There are 3 of them generally. The affective state scale is the one that often is what we see as human beings because we're so fine-tuned and hardwired to notice people's feelings and emotions. And our brain reads people's affect very quickly, actually. And so this is often the first sign that a client is in a crisis. And so a client, you might see one of several things. The client might be over-emotional and out of control and really, really elevated, or the client could be very flat and almost withdrawn and detached and cold and as if they're in shock almost. And that's interesting to think about as part of how that affect scale might show up. As a crisis worker, you have to think about or ask yourself when you're thinking about this scale, do the client's affective responses hint that the client is denying the situation or attempting to avoid involvement in it? So is the client, sort of on that lower end of reactivity? Is the emotional response normal or what you might expect to see with the situation that is happening with the client? Do other people typically show this kind of reaction or affect in situations such as this? And so you're kind of looking at what you see in front of you. Is the person, as I said before, highly activated or very withdrawn and flat? And also, is what you're seeing kind of typical for what you would think and what you might expect to see in a client who's experiencing this particular kind of crisis? So the affective states generally center around 3 categories, if you will, of reaction. One is anxiety and fear, another one is sadness or melancholy, and then the third one could be called frustration. And so that's just a, kind of a brief review of the affective state scale. Very much a generalized description of that. Okay, I'm going to turn off the clip because we're at 15 minutes and I'll start it up again.